tonight is Brent Bitz. He's from the Northern Arizona Audubon Society. He's on their board, so there are men on some of these boards, yeah. And Brent has traveled a lot of different places, sometimes when he wasn't a birder and sometimes when he was. And so he's going to talk to us now about, as I'm sure you've all read, birding in Baffin Island. With that, I'll turn it over to Brent.
Thank you very much, Laura. And so in terms of starting the program, there we are. Russ is going to get us going. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, tell you a little bit about Northern Arizona Audubon, because I'm here really not only for myself, and I want to thank all of you for the kind invitation to be here, but Northern Arizona Audubon, which is your next door neighbor, we really want to invite you and your friends to come on over to our side of the mountain sometimes. Mingus, especially in snowy weather, is a bit of an obstacle, but we'd love to have any of you want to come over on any of our trips. So please feel free to join us at any time, and likewise, I'm sure many of our members have from time to time come over here. So it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. So let me tell you a little bit about what you're going to see this evening. By way of background, I'm a Canadian. I've lived in your wonderful country for some 25 years, and I have a delightful and lovely American wife. But in the Canadian psyche, the high Canadian Arctic is very much like the American West of 100 years ago is to America. A vast land, sparsely populated, difficult and expensive to get to, an adventure when you get there, and not everybody in Canada ever gets there. As a matter of fact, most Canadians live in the southern part of the country and rarely get to the north. But it is a place that really people always want to get to, and I was fortunate enough in 2015 to put together a little trip for myself, which really consisted of two parts. One is independent travel. Whenever I go traveling, I like to do some on my own, and sometimes I'll arrange for a driver or a guide, which I did in this case, and sometimes I link it in with a birding tour company. And in this case, I needed to do that because the core and the exciting part of this trip, which you'll see, was basically birding on the ice floe on the northeast corner of Baffin Island. And what that means is basically, even in June, there's ice several miles out from the coast. It's frozen solid and affixed to the land. And basically, we went out in skidoos and sleds. Took us 8 hours to get to the edge of the ice floe, and we camped there for a week. And basically lived outdoors on the ice floe, on 18 to 24 inches of ice over 1,000 to 2,000 feet of ocean, right on the edge. And that is where the life is, very much like in a forest where you have a forest edge bordering on a field. Often you see a lot more life and variety because of that edge interaction. And that's what you're going to see this evening is when I was camping on the ice floe. And with regards to it being as far north as you can go on land birding, you really have to look at a map. And so what we've got here is Canada, Russia, Greenland. This is Baffin Island. This is the Arctic Circle at 66 degrees north, and you can see that this cuts through the southern third of Baffin Island. And I'll show you another map, but this is Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut. I'll talk about that. This is where Pond Inlet is, and that's where our base was. And if you look around the world, you basically, you really can't get any further north and do any birding. There's no place in the United States that's nearly as far north as this. You could do birding in Svalbard, which is Norwegian territory, but it's really off of ships there. There's very little opportunity to actually do it from the land. And Nunavut in Canada is as far north as you realistically can go. Canada has these huge islands much further to the north, but they're virtually uninhabited and almost impossible to get around. So from a realistic point of view, if you want to go north and do any birding, this is about as far north as you can go, unless you're in the military or you're some sort of PhD researcher. So a shot of, to give you a taste of what Baffin Island is like, this is the Barnes ice cap on Baffin Island. I have a map a little later on, but the eastern side of Baffin Island is very mountainous, not high because it goes right down to the ocean, but the mountains are about 5,000 feet. Baffin Island contains one of only two remnant glaciers from the last ice age. One of them is the Barnes ice cap, the other is in Greenland. All the other glaciers had disappeared and then reconstituted themselves after the ice age. So this is a land that is substantially frozen most of the year, and really in some small areas has never been unfrozen for a significant period of time. So a little bit about Canadian geography to set the evening up. With an area of 1.5 million square miles, the Canadian North, as I said, is an area that occupies a special place in the hearts of Canadians, much like the American West. And within this vast land, there's a Canadian Arctic archipelago, home to over 36,000 islands, some of which are among the largest in the world. So here's a map of Canada, and my trip took me from Ottawa, a 3-hour jet flight to Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut. I'll show you in a map. And I did some birding and hiking there, and from there, 4-hour turboprop up to Pond Inlet, which is here. This is Bylot Island. Bylot Island is a part of a national park in Canada, and the reason it's a national park is it's a huge bird breeding location, thick-billed murres, kittiwakes, all sorts of Atlantic pelagic species, and it is a protected area. It's jointly managed by the local Inuit community and the federal government. So it's an area that people rarely get to, but is one of the world's great seabird breeding colonies. So Nunavut. Nunavut is both the least populous and the largest of the areas of the provinces and territories of Canada. Canada consists of 10 provinces, but we have 3 territories which don't have the same political structure as a province. So to use an American analogy, think of Guam or American Samoa, truly part of America, but they don't have the same political structure or rights as American states. Although in Canada, the residents of the territories are Canadian citizens and they have their own legislature, but because they have such small populations, and in the case of Nunavut, an area that's the size of Western Europe has less than 32,000 people for that entire area. So it's a very thinly populated area, so they need the federal government to help provide the services that are essential in a modern world. Nunavut is also home to the northernmost permanently inhabited place in the world, which is Alert, which is a Canadian military base. Baffin Island is directly situated across from Greenland, and 2/3 of the island is above the Arctic Circle. And at 196,000 square miles, it's larger than California. It's the 5th largest island in the world, but has only 11,000 people, most of whom are Inuit, the native peoples of the Canadian North. And the term Eskimo is a term that is long out of style. These people refer to themselves as Inuit, and their language is Inuktitut. So here's a map of Nunavut, just to put it into perspective. This is mainland Canada. This is Baffin Island. There's Iqaluit. You can see the glaciated portion of the eastern side of the island, which is what we flew up in that picture of the Barnes ice cap, is located right in here. This is actually Alert, the northernmost community in the world. These islands up here only have 3 tiny Inuit communities, and they're essentially uninhabited. So my trip took me from here, did some time in Iqaluit, and then up to Pond Inlet, and from there was the rest of the trip. So this is my first view of Baffin Island flying over in the plane as we're starting to approach Iqaluit, and at that point I was starting to wonder about the wisdom of what I was doing, because this sure doesn't look like much of a birding location. And this is June. This was June 2015. And you look at it and you say, oh my goodness. And did I bring enough warm clothes? And that actually was a good point. I thought I was prepared. I had 4 layers on the top, 3 layers on the bottom. You basically are in a completely wet environment because things are starting to melt. So insulated gumboots are the order of the day, and mine were reputed to go to 25 below zero, and I can testify they surely do not. And when you're standing on the ice for the entirety of a week, your feet get cold. But we landed in Iqaluit. This is what Iqaluit looks like. As I mentioned, it's the capital Nunavut, small community of about 4,000 or 5,000. This is midnight, and you've heard of the north being the land of the midnight sun, and it truly is. The sun does not set during the summertime. All you do is you see it circle on a slight elliptical fashion around the horizon all day and all night long. And the only time it gets a little dusky, and it doesn't even really get dusky, is if it's cloudy. But otherwise, it's bright 24 hours a day. And of course, that translates into the opposite during the winter time. This is actually called Frobisher Bay, and just a little bit of history. Martin Frobisher was an English explorer in the late 1500s, and he sailed his ship from England into Frobisher Bay, was the first European to come to that part of the world, and actually, it's sort of an interesting story, he landed there, and of course, they're all looking for riches, right? So he came across something that he thought might be gold, so he goes back to England, convinces people to fund a second episode, another trip, goes back, gets more. Well, of course, it's not gold, it's sort of a quartzite. All his investors go bankrupt, and he's considered a bit of a charlatan. But interestingly enough, the slag heap from his excavation in like 1596 still exists and is an archaeological site that has been investigated by Canadian archaeologists. So it's sort of interesting to think that Europeans had gotten here quite a while ago, and of course they found the Inuit there well before them, living their lives. So here's a question. How do ravens keep warm in the winter when it is pitch dark for months on end and minus 40? A few months ago, there was one of our chapter members in northern Arizona, Audubon, spoke to us about Christmas bird counts. And as part of that presentation, he said, well, that part of North America that has the greatest bird count is the Texas coast. They have something like 360 species on their Christmas bird count, great variety. And then he said, the area that has the least number of species is a community called Arctic Bay, which was about 75 miles west of Pond Inlet. It has one species, the raven. They go out, they count the ravens. So they had 200 ravens and a Christmas bird counting. You think, well, how are ravens going to survive in pitch darkness for months on end Well, they've clearly adapted. And one of the ways they've adapted is just great. In Iqaluit, and I believe the case is the same in Arctic Bay, there are street lights. The only roads that exist anywhere in Nunavut are in the communities. There are no roads anywhere connecting communities. There are no two communities that are connected by any roads anywhere in Nunavut. So think of that. No roads in an area the size of Western Europe. Everything is, you either, in the very brief time when the ocean is navigable, you can do that, or on mainland in the rivers, the same. You can fly, which is very expensive, but the main communities all are linked by air. Or you can use sleds, but there are no roads. But in the communities, there are roads. They have street lights, and like every municipality, they try to manage their energy. So the street lights have little solar meters on them so that they're turned off and on depending on the sunlight. Well, the ravens have found out that in that time of year when the lights are off, if they go and fly and land on the solar meter, their body shields it, turns the light on, heats the fixture, and they get a toasty place to rest. And I think, good for them. That's how you survive in the Arctic, is you take advantage of the invasive species that we are, and you eat our food and enjoy our energy production. So I was doing, this is Iqaluit again for the next several slides. So while I did hire a guide for one day to take me around, because polar bears are something you have to really pay attention to, I also did some walking around on my own. And this being June, not everything was frozen up. The land was thawing out. And here you see a street sign, which you're not going to see many places, which says that really in the winter time, when there's enough snow, you got to be careful if you're driving your snowmobile not to hit a dog-pulled sled. And the reality is that while there still are dog-pulled sleds, they're really more of a hobby for people. The reality is the snowmobile is the absolutely most important vehicle in the Canadian Arctic. It's the only way people can get around, because for those many months of the year where the land is frozen, and for those additional months, as you're going to see, where the ocean and the rivers are frozen, the snowmobile is your way to get around. Most families have one or have access to one, and they're absolutely critical. So here I am in June in the Canadian Arctic. This is Frobisher Bay again, frozen solid. You can see snow all over the place. It's an overcast day. Everything's wet and marshy, hence the rubber boots that I told you about. You cannot go anywhere without rubber boots. No hiking boots with gaiters. You're just going to get them soaked. But there is a lot of life there. Spring flowers are coming up, and everything in the Arctic is very close to the ground. There's only one tree in the high Canadian Arctic. It's called an Arctic willow. They're a long-lived tree. They basically do not get any higher than 6 inches off of the ground, so they spread horizontally with sort of very small pencil-thick branches. And if you see one that's maybe 8 or 10 feet across, that's probably 150 or 250 years old. Everything is very slow growing because of the limited growing season and the poor quality from a nutritional point of view of the soil. Obviously, there's not a lot of organic matter there because of the short growing season. But what is there is very pretty, and when you pay attention as you're walking along, you can see a lot of life. But I'm here for the birds, and the Canadian Arctic is where they breed. So all the migratory, not all, but many migratory species that you occasionally see down here, and we do see long-tailed duck on the Colorado River and other places. This is where they breed. So I was fortunate enough to see many long-tailed duck. And I should mention that let's call them the snapshots, are my photos. All of the bird and animal photos are either taken by much better photographers than I, who are either on the trip, the guide, or other people friends of mine, or I must admit I cribbed some photos off of the internet, because sometimes that's a way to get a good photo for a presentation like this. American golden plover in breeding plumage, just beautiful purple flowers. The flowers were all over the place. You just have to pay attention to them. So the land is more colorful than it might appear. Of course, what would a trip to the Canadian Arctic be without Canada geese, snow geese? The Canadian Arctic is a major breeding ground for the snow geese that we see coming down here to Arizona. As a matter of fact, in some areas there's concern on the part of the federal government who are managing wildlife that the population of snow geese has gotten so great that it's crowding out some of the other migratory breeding species. I don't know what they're going to do about it, but it's a very healthy population. Snow bunting, large numbers of snow bunting, and the little buggers are so hard to see. You'd think white and black birds should be easy, but you hear all this chipping all over the place, and with the white snow and the gray rock, they're almost invisible. But they're a charming little bird. They're quite easy to get close to once you actually see them. They have a curiosity about them. A lovely bird, so many of those. Lapland longspur, lovely male there, breeding plumage. Northern wheat here, all of these birds are just here for a short period of time, breeding, raise their, or not even raise their young, hatch their young to the point where they can be independent, and they're gone. So there's a very short period of time to do birding in this part of the world. It's really June, July. August gets to be a different kind of flying creature, mosquitoes. We didn't have any problems where we were, but you can imagine what the tundra is like in this brief period of time. The mosquitoes come out, and it's one of the reasons all these birds are there, the insect life, they forage on it. But the main part of my trip really had to do with going to the very northern end of Baffin Island to Pond Inlet. I think there's only 3 communities in Canada that are further north than Pond Inlet, and each of them has a population of under 300. Pond Inlet has a population of about 1,000. This is Admiralty Inlet, which we'll talk about because that's the frozen waterway that became our highway. This is Bylot Island in the background. And Bylot Island is the island that I mentioned, is part of a national park and is a major seabird breeding location. They also have good populations of snowy owl and other wildlife, and there's no one lives on that island. There are a few seasonal huts that Inuit people have, and I'll show you some historical artifacts a little later on. But it is a truly wild location, very infrequently visited. So when you go to this part of the world, ice is both your friend and your enemy. Of course, if you're navigating in a ship, it's your enemy, but if you're one of the Inuit, the ice is very important because that's how you get out. You use it as a highway to get to the edge of the ice flow where you can hunt. And I'll talk about that in a second, but the Canadian government has a department, the Canadian Ice Survey, that produces a daily ice map for the Canadian North so that people know the conditions. Basically, this is Baffin Island, this is Greenland, this is Baffin Bay, this is where Pond Inlet is, this is Bylot Island, and the gray is ice that is still affixed to the land. It is not a floating flow or a mishmash of open sea and ice bergs. And so this is critical because that's what you can use as a highway for you. And basically what we were doing is we went from Pond Inlet out Admiralty Inlet to this little blue area, which is the open area that was the edge of the ice flow. And that's where we spent the week. And it was critical that you have these maps because there's a certain element of risk associated with this, because at this time of year, things are starting to melt and break off. The ice is anywhere from 18 inches to 2 feet thick. And as you'll see in some slides, it is not by any means always consistently connected. There are leads, which are big open areas, sometimes narrow, sometimes broad. And a couple of years before I was up there, as I mentioned, the Inuit do a lot of hunting as part of their subsistence culture. There was an Inuit family that had their snowmobile, were out on a floe. The floe broke off. They couldn't get off of it because it just blew away in the wind. And they were on that floe for over a month. They traveled 300 miles down the coast. They only survived because of their hunting skills. They were able to shoot seal, do a little bit of fishing, and ultimately the floe landed somewhere down in here, and they were able to get off and get to safety. So even people who are completely familiar with the terrain, accidents can happen. So you don't approach this with a degree of casualness, and only fools do. About 2 weeks before I was up in Pond Inlet, some German tourists had just decided to fly up. They thought it was a good idea, got their skis out, and proceeded to try to go across Admiralty Inlet. They didn't realize what the heck they were getting into. They couldn't cross the leads. The weather turned bad, and it was really the luck of the draw that they got back and didn't die. Now, let me talk a little bit about the Inuit. Inuit culture is a subsistence hunting society still. This is a polar bear that they had killed. They have the right to jointly manage the wildlife as part of their rights in Nunavut. And as a matter of fact, the Nunavut territory has a legislature that is essentially run by the Inuit themselves. And this is critical because when milk is $14 a gallon and you're trying to feed a family, potatoes are $9 a pound, and all of this has to be flown in, all the fresh produce has to be flown in because the ships can only come and provide the large bulk staples during a 2-month period when the water is open. Seal becomes an important and indispensable part of your life. And just as is the case in the United States, the economic conditions and employment opportunities for Native Canadians in the remote areas are very limited. The Canadian government provides all the centralized services, medical care, the schooling system, policing, all those sorts of things. But of course, the local people have to provide their own personal needs. So there's a lot of hunting for seals, some whales like beluga and narwhal, as you'll see. And that's just part of life. And I know sometimes it makes those of us who live in the South feel a bit uncomfortable, but when you go up there and you meet the people, you realize how essential it is. But again, I was up there for the birds, so I was out there walking before this tour that I was going to join started. The beautiful purple sandpiper in breeding plumage, red-throated loon on a little pond in the middle of town. I guess this pond couldn't have been more than 200 yards across, and perhaps that's why it was called Pond Inlet. Red knot, a species that's really under threat due to loss of habitat in Central and South America, but this is where they breed, or one of the places. Common ring plover. The airport runway strip is really just a gravel strip. Of course, you can't have asphalt up there. It would just heave and buckle away. And this little guy was just pecking his way on the edge of the airstrip. And you can sort of wander along the airstrip because there's only 1 or 2 flights that come in every once in a while. So it's not like you have to worry about being mowed over by a plane. hoary redpoll. So, this is how you get along, and this is the main car park, as it were, for the people in Pond Inlet. This is where, during the time when there's water that's frozen, and this is Admiralty Inlet again, they leave their snowmobiles and their sleds, and this is an example of their sleds adopted to modern style. Basically, traditional Inuit sleds were basically either out of caribou bone, sometimes whale bone, lashed together with sinew. They were relatively short and pulled by small teams of dogs, 2, 3, 4 dogs, and that's how they got around for their hunting. All of the wood that you see has to be flown in or brought in on ships. So these are now valuable because it's expensive to bring in these bulky items. They're lashed together so they have a certain amount of flexibility, because this ice flow that we're going across, and you'll see in a minute, is anything but smooth. It is not a wonderfully flat highway. But nonetheless, this is what we traveled in. You basically tie a snowmobile to one of these on the front. You load all your gear in. You put people, your wife, your kids, your dogs, paying Southerners like myself, and away you go. So this was our ice road for the next 8 hours until we hit Baffin Bay. So we loaded up, as I've shown there, and basically headed out here for 8 hours. Now, this was far more arduous than I thought it was going to be. It was cold. We were at 25 plus miles an hour, bumping over the surface that was much like a Conestoga wagon at 25 miles an hour, sitting on the wooden seat. And it started to get quite windy, and that's just the way it was. So it was by far the most arduous start to a birding trip that I've ever had. This, I want to explain a little bit, is a very small lead. Basically, leads occur when the ice breaks up. And of course, you've got currents, you've got tides. This is all open water in the peak of the summer. So the ice shifts around and it breaks. And you have to cross over that if you're going to go anywhere. Now, this water could be anywhere from 500 feet deep to 2,000 feet deep. It's straight down. You're in the middle, in this case, in the middle of the inlet, halfway between the shore, and either you go over this to get where you're going or you don't. And basically, the way it's done is you get to the lead and they disconnect the snowmobile backs up, takes a running leap, jumps over the lead, comes back, they throw the line across, they get it taut, and then pull you across quickly. And at the end of the show or presentation, I'll give you an example of why there's a certain anxiety level associated with this, because you're sitting in the sled when they're doing this pulling. Now, we have a clip here. There we are. This will show you what it's like. I filmed this from the back. And I was trying to hold the camera as steady as I could. So that's what we did for 8 hours in, maybe it was, well, it must have been about 25 degree temperature in 25 mile an hour winds. I was really lucky. As I say, I had underestimated how much cold weather gear I needed. I had stuff that I actually used in Antarctica. It was not adequate. Fortunately, the sled I was in had this old moth-eaten caribou skin, and I was able to wrap it around me and protect myself from the wind. And I've still got caribou hairs on the little Velcro in my jacket. But it was cold, and I was thinking, 6 or 7 days of this. So this was our camp, and in the back is Bylot Island. We were in a sheltered cove. The island really drops precipitously off, and we were, a few hundred yards off, just because that was where the flattest area was. So we basically lived outdoors 24 hours a day, except when we were in our sleeping bags to go to sleep. We had the cooking tent and a supply tents, but we were outside the entire time. I have to say, we were fortunate we did not have a big storm. There were times when it was overcast, times when it was windy, but there were lots of times when it was sunny, but it never got warm. I mean, freezing 32 degrees was as good as it got. But this is where we were, and all the cooking was in the tent, and we sat outside and had our meals, and that was it. It was an outdoor experience. So we're there, and you get up in the morning, and because you don't want to be camping right on the edge of the flow, as I mentioned, there's certain risk to that. We were about a half an hour from the edge in our campsite. And I should point out that there are polar bears everywhere. And this is not Disneyland. There's no fences, and you can't walk really much of a distance away from your camp or away from the sleds when we stopped and were doing our birding, because the bears are invisible. Really, the ice flow is filled with hummocks and little protrusions. The bears are literally invisible. They can move at 25 miles an hour in a heartbeat, and you just can't see them until they're there. So you really have to be careful because you're a snack. That's just it. But the first bird that we saw on getting our camp, we get set up, and a gear falcon decides to come over and check us out. This was a life bird for me. It was the only one that we saw, and that was great. I mean, I had a few birds that I was really hoping to see, and this was on the top of my list. Now, this was our guide. He was Inuit. He was, to show you how much the world has changed, he was born in an igloo. He's maybe in his 60s now. He's become a successful guide and community leader, and I literally would trust him with my life. But like most Inuit, a quiet man, great sense of humor, and just a great guy to be with, and I consider myself fortunate to be with him. And for any of you who've been to Canada, you'll notice the Tim Hortons hat. That's the donut chain that is all over, and I don't know where Shetty got it, probably down in Iqaluit. He got some donuts. So modern culture comes everywhere. So the Arctic fox, at this time of year, you have this vision of them being these beautiful white creatures, but they molt. And when we first saw one on the cliffs above our camp, someone said, "Is that a cat?" Well, they're quite small, and when they lose their winter coat, they really look quite small, and this is exactly what it looked like. It's this, sort of really mangy-looking critter, but they kept coming back. They were just hoping that we were going to leave some stuff out, but of course we were very careful. We didn't leave anything out. All the scraps, everything was, contained and, of course, taken back with us. So we disappointed them, but they were quite cute. And, they would scavenge off of polar bear kill, was really their prime thing at this time of year. So this is the edge of the flow. So what you do is you go out and you stand on 18 to 24 inches of ice for all day long, and you hope that you're going to see something that comes by. Basically, looking in this direction is Greenland. And that was like 150 miles away. We were about 5 miles offshore, so probably over 1,500 feet of open water in Baffin Bay. And as I say, the ice is, 18 to 24 inches thick. And basically the idea is you pull up, get out of the sled, set up your scopes, look around, and hope things come by. Because you're really not walking too far, mostly because of the polar bear. But there is lots of life there, and this is why we were there. King eider, lots of breeding population of king eider, and narwhal. Now, we got so lucky. The first day we get there, we pull up, it's about 8:30 in the morning. We're there for about an hour, and all of a sudden this large pod of narwhal, there was 75 to 100 of them, just came swimming by right near the edge of the flow. They were literally 10, 15 feet from us. You didn't even need binoculars to see them, and they were there for hours. They were fishing for the Arctic cod, which is one of their main food sources, which inhabit the edge of the ice flow. And for those of you who are not familiar with the story of narwhal, they're about 25 feet long. The male have what is a tooth. This is a tooth that protrudes through his forehead. It's not clear the purpose of this because the males do not use it for jousting in the course of their mating, nor do they appear to use it for self-defense. Nonetheless, it's there. And narwhal tusks are really the basis for the legend of the unicorn. In medieval times in Europe, these long spiral-shaped horns were brought to the courts of the kings and queens of Europe. In fact, they were narwhal tusks, but because no one knew that, in fact, they came from a whale, certainly not in England and France at that time, the myth grew that they came from the unicorn or a horse. But in fact, this is where they come from. And of course, they're very limited. The Inuit are allowed to hunt some narwhal. It's a managed kill. They eat the whole thing. We did see some hunting while we were there, and you completely understand it, as I pointed out earlier, on the cost for food. But it's a very seasonal thing because the narwhal can only be hunted when you've got this edge condition. So it's that narrow window of time between full winter, when the ice is frozen far too far out to Baffin Bay for them to get to, as opposed to the time when it's close enough, but before it melts and you can't get out there at all. You could, as I say, we saw, maybe 100 of them. But again, lots of birds, different types of gulls, Sabine's gull, Iceland and Thayer gulls, all scavenging on the for little pieces of life. There's krill and shrimp-like creatures, or something that other birds have eaten, small herring-like creatures, fish that grow there. Picture of a king eider. The males are just spectacular in their breeding plumage. As I say, this is one of the main areas in Canada where they have breeding grounds. This is a mixed flock. You can see a king eider in the background, but most of these are common eider. And we saw common eider by the thousands. If we saw king eider by the dozens or 25 or 50, literally the common eider were by the hundreds. And walrus would come up. Now, we really were lucky. Walrus, there are not that many. They're not endangered, but they don't have large populations. And especially when you get out to the sea edge and you're 1,000 feet or more above the ocean bottom, I wouldn't have thought that the walrus would be there. But it turns out that they can dive up to 2,000 feet down, and of course they use their tusks to scoop up bivalves that are at the bottom. And I was surprised that they'd be where we were, but we saw them, and they're curious. They come quite close. The Inuit give them great respect because in the water, if you're in a small skiff, they can be quite aggressive, and the Inuit give them a wide berth. They do a little bit of hunting for them. It's, again, very closely managed because they're anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 pounds. They're a mammoth creature when you get to see the big whale or males. Again, common eider. This is an example of a flock that you see. We were standing there with our scopes and just see them come, and they'd be there for an hour, and then somehow they would just all disappear. The currents would take them, or they'd fly off for another place, and you'd be sitting there looking for a cup of tea to warm yourself up, and there was nothing, and then something else would come in. It was sort of like watching a series of short movies, with intermissions in between. Now, I mentioned about polar bears. So you can see someone putting his hand next to a polar bear track. We had been out one day, then came the next day to the same location. There was the polar bear paw print. See, they've got large paw prints, and they just roam around at will. They're quite curious. They are not at all afraid, even though there is a limited hunting of them. It is so limited that it's not like some creatures where they know they simply can't be near human species. In fact, they're the kings of this part of the world, and that's how they treat it. So I was thinking, oh great, our guides have rifles. So Shaddy brings his rifle out. This is a World War I Lee Enfield rifle. It's over 100 years old. Shaddy is maybe in his 60s, and I was teasing him. The rifle is older than him, and I wasn't greatly comforted by the fact that we were going to be protected by a 100-year-old rifle. That the Canadian government, God knows why they kept these things, but handed them out to the Inuit as part of what is called the Arctic Ranger program, which is a quasi-militia / search and rescue entity that consists entirely of Inuit people. They keep an eye on the conditions of the wildlife. They provide a very important role, and the government funds them. They've since been provided more modern weapons because you really don't want to go out with a 100-year-old rifle. But Shaddy had this, and this was his backup rifle. He had a modern high-power rifle, which he kept tucked away. But I think he used it just to scare us Southerners, to say, hey, this is what's going to happen. So this is a polar bear, and this guy was just wandering along the shore where we were birding, saw us, just plopped himself into the water, swam, crossed through the ice floes, got off on the far side, shook himself off. By then I had him in my scope, and I could just see the spray coming off of him like I was in some sort of National Geographic HD TV program. And then he rolled around on the snow and then proceeded to have a snooze. And these are various gulls that weren't worried about him at all because they knew, he couldn't catch them. And so he just took it easy. But he came, as I say, he came out of nowhere, but he wasn't worried about us. Again, we were there for the birds. Lots of black guillemots, huge breeding colonies. 100 or 200,000 birds are breeding on Bylot Island. Lovely, bright, red-orange legs, and they'd fly by, dive into the water to get food. Just lovely creatures. We saw 3 species of Jaeger: Pomeranian Jaeger, parasitic Jaeger, and long-tailed Jaeger. And of course, they're really the raptor surrogate in this part of the world. They would harass all the other birds into either dropping what they had in their mouths, chase them off of something if they had something and they were eating it on the land. They were very aggressive. and occupied a very interesting niche. They didn't have high population densities, but they were clearly in charge. They were in charge of the gulls, and they were certainly in charge of the pelagic seabirds. These are dovekies. They're very small. I'm not a great ornithologist by any means. I'm of modest skill, but they're sort of a small auk-like bird, or a small puffin-like bird, about this, maybe larger than my hand, but they are there in large numbers as well, big breeding colonies on the cliffs. Most of these pelagic birds spend their rest of their year, the winters, in the North Atlantic. Some of them go further south. And it's only recently that the Canadian government has been able to ascertain what the real breeding patterns are with modern tracking devices. Tens of thousands of thick-billed murres. This is a photo of Bylot Island from the edge of the flow. Gives you an idea of just the rugged terrain of that island. And these cliffs, some of them were where the birds were breeding, so they would occupy the cliff faces, lay their eggs, as I'm sure you've all seen, and they would fly out to the edge, which is why we were there, for food, and then they'd fly back. And so it was a back and forth commute every day, just like us. We went from our camp to the edge. They went from their nest to the edge as well. There were some tube noses, northern fulmar, and thousands of black-legged kittiwake, which really this was the most prominent species that we saw. And this is tea time. When you get there at 8 in the morning and you're standing and it's like 30 degrees and the wind is 10 or 15 miles an hour and you're walking back and forth, you're looking at the birds, tea time and lunch are great breaks. Basically broke out the Coleman stove and, had some candy bars. And you can see this must have been a fairly benign day because our guide didn't have his hood up. Now, the one, sometimes if you go on a trip, they ask you if you have any advice, and I told him, I said, you really should have told us that you were wearing 6 layers, and I only came up with 4. So you need to give us a clothing, list in advance. And but terrific guy. It was a small Canadian company out of British Columbia that I went up with. They had done this 5 years ago, and then I was fortunate enough they decided to do it again. And he had another Canadian birding guide who has got a 7,000 bird life list. And so between the two of them, we were well taken care of from the point of view of ornithology and natural history, and from the point of view of the Inuit crew members who were with us and taking care of the snowmobiles and our guides and the food. We were well taken care of. So Bylot Island, which, as I say, is a national park, is rarely visited, but one day we went onto the island and walked up this small river, which was only starting to trickle. Later in the season, perhaps July or August, this would be a real full-fledged river as the snow would melt from the glaciers higher up. But at this point, all it was extremely boggy tundra on the side and the trickles over the riverbed. But we went there to see this. Everyone knows that there's been the igloo. And everyone thinks that the Inuit somehow were living in igloos all the time. That's not the case. Inuit historically were a semi-nomadic people, and the igloo was their winter hunting shelter. Because they had to live by hunting seal, and seal are available 12 months of the year because the seal would chew air holes and then come up and rest on the surface, even though it's dark, and go back down to hunt and feed off the fish. That's how they live. So when they went out on the land in the wintertime, they did the igloos, but their more permanent accommodations, or their summer hunting camps, consisted of pit houses that were cut out of the tundra, often on hillsides, and lined with stones, or in this case, the vertebra of a bowhead whale, lined with stones. They would create a roofing structure of either caribou bones or bowhead whale rib cages and cover it with seal skin. This is in an archaeological site. No one knows how old it is, but according to local oral tradition from the Pond Inuit, this is several hundred years old. It's no longer in use, of course, and we were privileged enough to be able to see it. It's something that's rarely visited by tourists at all. And all I can say is those were really tough people. I have tremendous admiration for people eking out a living in what is arguably the most difficult ecological niche on the face of the planet. Just think of it, many months of the year, pitch black. There is no source of fuel except seal or whale blubber because there is no wood. You can't cook your food because you don't have enough seal oil. All you can do is use the seal oil for your light inside your igloo or your hut. You can use it to mix with your berries to dry them out and to create a sort of a biscuit sort of thing that you can use for a number of months. But there is no fuel to cook your food. So everything is eaten raw your entire life. That has to be the way it is. And the Inuit mostly are a maritime culture, so they used kayaks or what are called umiaks, which are sealskin boats. And in those boats, which are maybe 20 feet long, they'd go out with a caribou bone harpoon and harpoon a whale. I just can't imagine doing that. But that's what they did. But again, we're up there for the birds, redneck phalarope, Pacific loon. I didn't think I was going to see a Pacific loon in the high eastern Canadian Arctic. Saw the red-throated loon, but we saw a mating pair of Pacific loon there as well. And I must say, this photo is cribbed from the internet, but I saw this so many times. A kittiwake has got like a minnow in its mouth, and there is a parasitic and Pomeranian Jaeger chasing it to get it to drop its food. That is so typical of the environment up there. And we did see one bowhead whale. We were very fortunate to see one. They are adapted to the environment because they do not have a dorsal fin, so they are the Arctic whale. They were previously called the right whale by the whalers because they float, they do not sink, and they're a very long-lived species. I guess about 10 years ago, a bowhead whale died naturally, and a local Inuit community found it. They must have been out hunting for seal, brought it to shore because it had just freshly died, and proceeded to butcher it. They found a harpoon head inside the whale that the archaeologists had dated to 1840. So that whale, which died, 2005, was harpooned by a whaling fleet in 1840. So who knows how old it was at that time. So they certainly live, say, 200 years, and they have a very slow reproduction cycle, but they are coming back. There is a very limited opportunity for once every several years. A few Inuit community are given the right to hunt whales, bowhead whales, and it is a major cultural event for them. They're not hunted for food typically, but it is as much a spiritual experience as anything else, and it is part of their tradition. But we were fortunate enough to see one, and that was a rare occurrence because the population density is so low. And here is one of the birds that was on my all-time life list, the ivory gull. Now in Canada, there are only 300 breeding pair of ivory gulls in the entire country. They're all in the very high Canadian Arctic. They basically live off of the scraps that polar bears or Arctic fox leave behind. So unlike most gull species that are able in a marine environment to get scraps of food or fish, from the surface, ivory gulls are dependent on scraps, right? So there's very few of them, and we were hoping to see one, day 1, day 2, day 3. Finally, on the last day, maybe we'll see one. So anyhow, about noon, we were there, and our guide, who, thank God for guides, they've got great eyes, says, look, there's a pair of ivory gulls. And about 100 yards away, right on the edge floe, was a pair of ivory gulls. So we all get very excited, so we whip out our scopes, and we're at 100 yards, right by our sleds. So, of course, that's not good enough. You all know that. It's not good. I've got to get closer. So what if I've got a 60 power scope and it's only 100 yards away? I can't see, the eye-ring as clearly as I want, right? So we go 80, we go 20 yards. So now we're 80 yards away. Then 60 yards away. And then about 40 yards away. And the birds are very calm. They're not like some species which are very nervous and fly away. So we're there. And by now we're a bit of a distance from the sled. And so we're looking at the ivory gull and, just admiring it. It's right by the shore. And all of a sudden our guide hollers, polar bear. So I look around and there's this polar bear about 100 yards behind us, came out of nowhere, and he was going diagonally across the path that we had just come from on our sled. So I'm going, ivory gull, polar bear, ivory gull, polar bear. Which do I look at more? So, it's like, but he's, it's just like, this is not Disneyland, folks. It's not like one of these thrill rides. It's the real thing. But he just sort of wandered along. He was calm, and he just disappeared. But that was the highlight because, well, I don't think I've been as close to a bear, certainly not one that came up on me so close. So, anyhow, that was the last day. So now we're heading back, and I told you about the leads, right? Well, the last day, the idea was that we were going to have a couple of extra snowmobiles come out from Pond Inlet. They were going to leave very early to help us bring all of our gear back, because we had a lot of gear, and we had 2 extra snowmobiles come out when we went out there, and then they went back. They didn't stay with us. But the wind picked up to about 25 miles an hour, and they were afraid they were going to get tipped over. So we waited. We finally decided we had to go. Okay, so about noon, we load everything. We overload all the snowmobiles. They're full to the gills. All the sleds are heavily laden, and off we go. One of the snowmobiles kept breaking down. We get it fixed, and we're in the middle of nowhere, right? And we start to come to these larger leads. Well, the winds has shifted this ice around, and you can see when you're in a sled and the front is here and the back is here, that's a significant difference. You're not jumping over this, right? You're not taking a leap. So, and we were in these sleds, right? And when you're there, you don't get out. We got out while they were organizing this. So this is sort of the beginning of a picture now. Is it this one or the next one? There we are. There. So he's disconnected. He's going back to get a running jump to cross this lead that's maybe 15 feet across. So he does that, and then he backs up and connects to the sled and then pulls the sled across. And the theory is that by really gunning the snowmobile, you're going to get enough momentum so it doesn't fall back down into the hole. Here, let me just back up. You can see that there's not much extra sled there. So what you don't want to do is be on that sled and the front third gets onto the good side of the lead, but he doesn't pull you hard enough and the whole thing just falls down and then you fall into the water. That's not a good thing. So this is what we did time and time again, and I just took that one shot to give you a feeling of what it's like. And so, I was standing. There's one poor fellow. This gentleman really didn't handle the cold very well, and on the way back, he wasn't moving. And the sled was fairly loaded, and I ended up having one leg on the outside, one leg on the inside, and he was not going to move to give me any more space. So we go jump, all of a sudden it's bam, 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 as the front end drops down, goes up, then the rear end drops down, there's a splash of water and kicks up as we get to the other side. And I don't think he knew that I was half in and half out, but I'm here, what the heck. So this is the last slide. We get back to Pond Inlet at 1 a.m. The sun is still up. It's a magnificent evening. The clouds are racing by, the sort of the dramatic feel. I saw around 42 or 43 bird species, so there weren't a lot of species count compared to some places. But between the numbers that we saw, and the other wildlife, not to mention the wonderful interaction with the Inuit people, it was really one of the great experiences of my life. So that's it for this evening, and I want to thank you all very much for being here.